millennials,
Oh,
but
we
that
are.
generation is Gen Z. The Greta Thunberg generation is
Yeah.
amazing. And they all think we're pathetic, and I'm like, and they're like, they've all got side pangs, and I was like, ah! Welcome to Welsh Wednesdays with me, Kiri, Pritchard-McLean, and
Me, Katie Gill-Williams.
if you've not seen Welsh Wednesdays before, we are two dysgwyr. Is that how I say it?
The score, yeah.
Or dysgwyr is something else. Dysgwr is nothing. Dysgwr, who so we're learning Welsh, and every week we talk about a different Welsh subject that we think is important to talk about, and then we have a sgwrs bach, a little chat at the end in Welsh as best we can to help ymarfer, help practice our Welsh. And this week I've gone for the Feel Good Riot, the incredibly heavy a tragic story of the Cardiff Five and the murder of Lynette White. So apologies in advance if you're looking for a light-hearted romp. So I'm not gonna get too heavy into it because it's not a true crime podcast. I've got another one of those going on in my life. But basically what happened on Valentine's Day 1988, Lynette White was killed in Cardiff, and on James Street. And what happened was, I'm going to try and sort of put it into a nutshell. She was a sex worker in the area. She's very well liked. She was seen around. Lots of people knew her, and she went missing. And they thought she went missing because she was due to give evidence in somebody's trial, so they thought that she was lying low. But it turns out that she'd been basically a fellow sex worker that she knew had given her keys to a flat to use to work from, and she went round to sort of a neighbour threw some keys out because she was like, I haven't seen Lynette and she hasn't given the keys back, so she could get into the main building but not into the flat. That's when she went to the police and said, listen, I haven't heard from my friend, and they were like, oh, we've already got a warrant for her arrest because she dodged court. So they went into the flat, and unfortunately she'd been very brutally murdered.
Yeah, only 20, and just tragic, just horrible, yeah, and brutal, really, kind of reading about what happened. It's another of Wales's history that I didn't know about. I don't know whether that's, I mean, it was 1988, so I was like 3, but I don't know whether that's just media reporting, which is quite an interesting aspect about what gets covered in, as like a UK or a British news story, really. So I've first I've heard of this story, really.
So what happened is, there is an eyewitness account of a guy who was seen the night that she was murdered in the doorway to the flats, covered in blood, sort of sobbing and going, what have I done? So a description of him is put out. He is white, and this becomes relevant because 5 men are arrested and 3 are incarcerated for the murder of Lynette White, and they are all black. So this is why it's a particularly horrific stain on the history of Wales, and in particular the South Wales Police. It took Lynette's actual murderer, Geoffrey Goffor, I think he pronounced his name as, 10 years after murdering her to be brought to justice. And in that time, 5 innocent men were put through absolute hell. And to read between the lines, it was by virtue of the fact that they were a different colour. And so this all happens in Butte Town, sort of down Tiger Bay, which has always been a fairly diverse area. There's big sort of communities there of people, from all over the world originally, who have settled and made Wales their home and who are Welsh. But obviously, it seems like in the late 80s, this wasn't an easy mix with the police necessarily. Stephen Miller, who is her boyfriend and pimp, is arrested and he is convicted. He's one of the 3 that's convicted. Tony Paris is also arrested and convicted. Youssef Abdullahi is also arrested and convicted. And then John Actie and Ronnie Actie were both arrested and questioned. it just seems incredibly tragic, because when John Actie found out, he knew her and he was absolutely devastated because he'd heard about this really sort of violent murder. So lots of the men sort of knew her or moved in similar circles, but just by virtue of the fact they lived in the area, and then were sort of dragged in, and some of them, like John Actie had, since his father passed away when he was young, had sort of gone off the rails, as in he'd been in lots of what had been like young offenders institutes at the time, but they weren't murderers by any stretch. So it was sort of seems like it's a very clear case of racial profiling, especially when you have someone seen on that night covered in blood at the property who is white, who has been, witnesses have said he's white, and then you go out and arrest 5 black guys is absolutely insane to me.
One of the biggest things, and I don't understand how it changed, but I can only suggest something, and it's about the context of society at the time and what was happening economically, and what was happening with Tiger Bay. But so initially there was a photo fit sent out on Crime Watch, so national television, and it identified the suspect as a white man. But also, like, running along at the same time, there was a lot of talk about Cardiff Bay being an area that really needed to redevelop, to move forward. It was a bit run down, and like that's where we want our less desirables to be.
Eventually, Stephen Miller, who they say had a sort of a mental age in terms of dealing with consequences and things, of about 11, he confesses to her murder, and he implicates Tony Paris and Yusuf Abdullahi. Now, he confesses after 307 separate denials on tape with the police. But the police kept saying, "You did it, you did it, you did it, you did it." And what happens with lots of false confessions is there's basically police harassment leading up to it. So he implicates these other guys. The police then go to other sort of sex workers and go, "You're going to be in real trouble unless you back up this story." So this absolute monster fictitious story appears between these people who are all sort of guessing what the police want from them and hoping that that means the police will leave them alone, and it's just incredibly tragic. So it goes to trial in 1989 and they found guilty in 1990. The trial is also plagued with things that it goes on for about 6 months, and then the judge has a heart attack, so they have to start the trial again. All this time these men are in prison. And so yeah, the 3 men get convicted, because they all plead not guilty as well, which means that they have longer to wait till they're paroled. um and how some of the reason it starts to come is actually the press. The Channel 4 do a documentary about it, and papers are running stories about no one in the area thinks this is what happens, and they think this is a miscarriage of justice. So yeah, it goes to trial, and there's an appeal in 1992, and all 3 convictions are overturned. Here's another annoying thing: is when they were at first they refused to reinvestigate the case, reopen it, which meant that they were like, no, those are our guys, even though it had been overturned, which is horrific, because that meant that Lynette's family didn't get justice. Lynette didn't get justice. Also, the guys who'd wasted their lives. I mean, Yusuf Abdullahi was diagnosed with PTSD after the conviction and the questioning, because that's the thing, is it must be, I can't imagine what it's like being, like a lad about Cardiff who's a bit of a, like, sells a bit of weed here and there, or a bit of a dodgy dealer, and then suddenly, like, you found guilty of murder and you weren't even there on the night. Like, absolutely terrifying situation to be in. Case was reopened in 2000, based on some cellophane at the crime scene, and they weren't able to connect it to someone. And then in 2002, DNA moves forward again, and they test some of the stuff, and they found, okay, well, there's a partial match with someone here, but this kid wasn't born when the crimes happened. So they checked his uncle, and it was Jeffrey Goffer, who was the guy who killed him. So then there's a huge investigation in how do you send 3 innocent men to prison, and the guy who did it has been walking free for absolutely years. Um, so the IPCC investigates in 2005. They make 30 arrests, 19 of which are police. There's all sorts of horrific stuff that goes on with evidence that just goes missing. It's really, really damning. Horrific uh, George Floyd murders and the following murders and the murders that keep happening. It's easy to go, it's an American problem, but like we've had examples in our history in Wales. And also I think it's easy to look at racism as well and say, well, that's an English problem, because we as a nation can feel oppressed, to say, well, we can't be oppressors, and of course we can, because like white supremacy permeates through everything.
The murder of Lynette White is just awful, but what kind of comes out of it and what's uncovered in this institutional racism is a byproduct that we don't want to admit. We don't want to face up and go, we've got problems, like there is an issue, and that boils down to us as individuals as well.
Definitely.
Hard mirror. Because as much as we don't want to admit it, and it's murky and it's horrible, we have to sometimes face up to the prejudice. You were saying we have to face up to our own inner prejudice as well in order to change things. And when we were going to talk about this subject, it's quite a difficult one because I don't feel that I'm fully educated or clued up. I feel like I've got so much to unlearn. And I'm not telling this story because, it's a bit of a brag, but I was climbing a mountain in Africa for charity. And I went with a friend of mine, a black friend of mine, and we were walking back down. We'd been walking for ages. It was such a long day. And we suddenly decided to debate racism in, I think it was in Russia. And she was talking about this documentary she'd watched. And she said, Russia is a racist country. And me, just being totally ignorant, was like, well, I don't think you can say that about a whole country, because imagine if you live there and you're not racist and you're being classed as being part of a racist country. And she's like, but it is. This went on for ages and ages, and it got a bit heated. And it's taken me a while to sit back and go, I don't know how the fuck she didn't throw me off that mountain, because how dare I stand there, never having experienced any sort of prejudice or oppression because of the colour of my skin. Never, ever. And I'm questioning my friend, who's a black girl. She's had to face all sorts of kind of hurdles and boundaries and push through them. And to this day, I'm so embarrassed that I dared question that.
I've definitely been guilty of sort of, like thinking there were no black people in Wales, just, like because I grew up in North Wales and it wasn't diverse, and just thinking like, oh no, you can't be black and Welsh, not as in you're not allowed to be, just like it just doesn't exist, which is
Yeah.
absolutely ridiculous and really ignorant, and something I had to, like very recently sort of get my head around. It just hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah.
Part of me was like, should we even talk about this, because like who are two white ladies to talk about racism? But I think what we need to talk about is, as white people, it's our responsibility. It's not black people's job, or people of color in general, to clear up the mess that we're allowing. Really important to acknowledge that Wales is diverse, and it's something do you know what, something I have to struggle with is, I think I've talked about this with you before, like the people I know who are first language Welsh or fluent Welsh speakers who are people of colour, I really sort of, I think, fetishize in my head, and I'm like, look, they speak Welsh, and you know what it is, I know it's coming from a place where I think no one can deny them their Welshness if they speak the language.
Yeah.
And that's like, but also, it's lovely if you speak the language, but you shouldn't have to be fluent in a language to be deemed Welsh enough.
I've got this really liberal view of like, just break down all of these boundaries of what country's this, what's this. We talked about flags, didn't we? And we'll talk about a bit more. But really, that's such an easy answer, and such a wanker's kind of plaster to put on things, because we have to, as well as kind of break down these boundaries, we have to fight for people's identity as well.
Talk about it in Welsh, because I think talking about it in Welsh, weirdly, how we'll talk about it is more important.
Yeah.
achos mae'n anodd i siarad am hiliaeth? Hiliaeth?
Ydy,
Racism?
ddim yn gwybod gair am racism.
Yeah, dwi'n meddwl hiliaeth, dwi'n
Mhm.
meddwl. Achos yn Saesneg, dwi'n dysgu a dwi'n dechrau dallt issues a iaith around hiliaeth. Ond yn Gymraeg, dwi eisiau cael sgwrs am, you know, pethau mawr fel hiliaeth, ond mae'n anodd achos dwi ddim yn cael y iaith i express myself correctly. Ond dwi'n I've written down one word that's amr amrw am AMRYWIAETH. Amrwaith?
Amrywaeth, ie.
Yeah, dwi'n
Amrywiaeth.
meddwl amrwaith. Yeah, amrwy dwi'n meddwl mae'n bwysig i dallt Cymru ydy amrwyaeth. Diversity. Yeah, wedi cael lawer o amrwyaeth achos mae gwlad bach efo'r, you know, dim lawer o pobl, ond lawer o pobl dod yma a call it home. Ers Industrial Revolution a mining, lawer o pobl dod from, can't remember what from is now, God, too tired. Do,
Just
o,
like o.
yeah. Oh yeah, dod o y byd a, you know, waith yma a caru yma a byw yma a siarad yma a siarad y iaith achos mae'n yn Pen-y-Goes, ger Caernarfon, llawer o pobl, like Bangladeshi, Chinese, you know, like, black people from all over, a what's the word? A pawb siarad Cymraeg. Oh, mae'n, yeah, it's just hyfryd iawn. Ond mae'n bwysig i acknowledge Cymru wedi hir ffordd i mynd, long way to go. Yeah, dwi ddim yn gwybod y iaith i siarad am hiliaeth. Dwi ddim achos dwi gofyn fi ffrind do you say pobl ddi? And they were like, oh, dwi ddim yn gwybod achos dwi'n meddwl pobl ddi yn hen ffas and a bit like how, you know, we were brought up to say coloured and we would never say that now. So dwi'n meddwl dwi'n dweud pobl o lew, people of colour. Ond dwi ddim yn yeah, dwi ddim yn I don't know if it's right. Do you know what I mean? I'm translating the English version, and that's not to say that's the language of Wales when it comes to talking about this. And I'd be really mae'n ddiddorol i dysgu iaith achos mae'n bwysig i dysgu basically it's important, I think, to interrogate the language that's being used in Welsh.
Y pwnc heno yn mwy anodd achos dwi ddim yn teimlo fel dwi'n paratoi. Hefyd, dwi ddim yn teimlo fel dwi'n gwybod llawer digon o hanes Mae 'na problemau yn y ysgolion dros y UK, dim just Cymru, dros y UK. A hefyd mae'n anodd i gwbod neu i golygu mae 'na problemau yn y heddlu, achos ges i parch am heddlu, ond y mwy dwi'n dysgu, y mwy dwi ddim yn siŵr. Dim individuals, mae'n institution.
Mm.
Oh, be arall? Dwi'n drist amdan y stori, a dwi'n poeni achos roedd stori yn cael newyddion, ond llawer o stori o pobl o lliw, a mae nhw'n ddim yn cael newyddion o gwbl, dim coverage, ac mae'n poeni amdano fo. Yeah.
You said that sometimes you don't feel like you know enough about the history of it, and then you were talking about it being like you saying you have a lot of respect for the police, but the more you learn about it, the more you, because you see the police as like, well, it's not, it's the organization that has the problem, not the individuals. But the more you learn about it, the more you're kind of not sure. And you were saying it's sad, and then I've forgotten because of the old ADD.
I'm not sure I've made much sense anyway, but I said golygu. I think it's hard to show that there's problems, but what I meant to say was it's hard to face up to the problems. And I was saying there's problems in schools as well about how it's taught. I ended with was saying what I worry about is the fact that this story had coverage and there's loads of stories that don't.
Yeah.
And what about those people who don't have the people or the infrastructure behind them to fight for them?
Like the discussion is happening, which means that's the first step of moving forward, I think, is acknowledging there's even a problem. And there is a problem in Wales with race, like, and it's important to say that, but it's not we're smart enough and kind enough to fix it, but it has to be on our list of priorities.